40 seconds before he opened that door. Salvatore Marchetti had ended a man's life without ever touching him. He'd poured the man wine, asked after his wife, let him finish his dinner, then slid an envelope across the table and said one quiet sentence that erased 60 years of a name from New England. Nobody moved. Nobody ever did. That's who he was at 34. A man who never raised his voice because he'd never once needed to. Then he climbed the stairs to the east wing of his house, the wing only 3 people on Earth had a key to, and he heard running water. His hand was already reaching for the drawer beside the bed before his eyes caught up, and what he found was a woman in his bathtub, buried to the collarbone in white foam, gripping the rim with both hands like it was the last solid thing left in the world. Adeline Brennan, 28 years old, the night nurse who'd been caring for his mother for 6 months. Auburn hair falling loose, gray-blue eyes wide open, knuckles cracked raw from surgical alcohol. She'd been told he was in Montreal until Sunday. And in the half-second it took her to understand who'd just walked through that door, she did the arithmetic that poor people learn to do faster than anyone else. Every hospital in Rhode Island had already turned her away. This was the last job that would have her, and she was about to lose it over 10 minutes of hot water. Salvatore turned his back, pulled the door shut, and stood in that hallway far longer than any man like him ever stands anywhere. Because what he'd seen in her face wasn't what he expected to see. And when he finally walked back into that bathroom, what she'd left behind told him more about her than any file ever could. If stories like this one mean something to you, hit that like button and share it with someone who'd appreciate it. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to that hallway and to the 10 minutes that changed everything for both of them. She put her uniform back on in the room that was still heavy with steam, and her hands were trembling so badly that she couldn't fasten the row of buttons. She tried once, then a second time, and finally gave up on the top button and grabbed her old cloth bag. But before she opened the door and stepped outside, she did something she herself didn't have time to understand. She turned back. She drained the bathtub completely, wiped away every trace of foam still clinging to the stone rim, folded the towel into a neat square, and placed it exactly where it had been, then turned the soap bottle until the label faced the same direction she had seen it facing every time she passed this room during the past 6 months. She did all of those things while knowing perfectly well that the man standing outside could end her life with a single phone call. Only then did she step into the hallway. He was standing with his back to the window, both hands in his pockets, and he didn't turn around immediately. She held the bag against her chest, like someone preparing to leave a place forever. When he finally turned, he asked only one question, his voice so quiet that she had to hold her breath to hear it. He asked who had given her the access card to this east wing. In Adeline's mind appeared the face of the elderly woman sitting in the armchair downstairs, her trembling hand placing the keycard into Adeline's palm that afternoon and telling her that she had the right to let in anyone she wished. Adeline thought about that for exactly 1 heartbeat. Then she answered that no one had given it to her, that she had come in by herself. She said she had walked past that door for 6 months, that tonight she was tired, she was curious, and she was wrong. She didn't invent a leaking pipe. She didn't claim she had felt faint. She didn't say that she had worked 2 shifts back to back and that her feet had swollen so badly she could barely fit them into her shoes. She only said that she was prepared to accept whatever consequences came and that she wanted to repay everything she had used, even if she had to pay it back little by little each week, if her employer would allow it. Salvatore said nothing for a very long time. In the world he lived in, people defended themselves faster than they breathed. He had sat across from men who blamed their wives, their children, the weather, even the dead, just to avoid saying the words, "I was wrong." He had heard explanations so elaborate they were almost works of art. Yet the woman standing in front of him, the woman who would lose everything if he spoke a single word, had chosen the shortest answer and the one most damaging to herself. He looked at her hands. The knuckles were cracked, red, so dry that looking at them was enough to make his own skin ache. Those weren't the hands of someone who knew how to arrange circumstances in her favor. They were the hands of someone who washed them 40 times a day and never had time to put anything on them afterward. He told her she wasn't fired. Adeline's head came up sharply, certain that she had misheard him. He repeated himself in the same quiet voice, saying that she had crossed a boundary and it couldn't happen again. But he saw no reason to destroy a person's life over a bathtub full of warm water. He told her to go home and sleep. She opened her mouth to say thank you, but all that came out was a broken breath. She lowered her head and hurried down the stairs, and he listened to the sound of her footsteps growing fainter until the downstairs door closed. When the whole house had gone quiet again, Salvatore stepped into the bathroom. He stood there and looked. Not a single drop of water remained on the stone floor. The towel had been folded into a perfect square. Its outer edge facing the same direction towels were arranged in a hotel. The soap bottle had been turned the right way. The entire room was cleaner than it had been when he left on Monday. That woman, while certain she was about to lose the last job that had been willing to take her, had spent her final minutes restoring this room to exactly the way he had left it. Salvatore stood motionless for a very long time in that perfectly silent room. All his life, he had learned to read people by what they said when they were backed against a wall. But that night, a neatly folded towel told him more about her than any file his people could ever bring him. The last bus dropped her at the edge of Fox Point, when the night had already grown late, and she walked the rest of the way with the cloth bag held against her chest, still in the exact same posture she had carried when she stepped out of that hallway. Her apartment was directly above a bakery, where the ovens started running before dawn and kept both rooms filled with a heavy warmth, sweet with the smell of flour. On the wall opposite the small bed, drawings of fire trucks covered the space from the baseboard to higher than a child could reach, every one of them drawn by a 6-year-old hand, every one of them red, and no two exactly alike. The neighbor who watched Micah for her had fallen asleep in the chair. Adeline gently woke her, pressed that week's money into her hand, thanked her, then saw her to the door. The boy was sleeping on his side, one hand still loosely holding a colored pencil. She eased the pencil from his fingers, pulled the blanket higher, then sat on the edge of the bed and stayed there for a very long time without doing anything at all. The next morning, she didn't wake him with an alarm. She sat on the edge of the bed, placed a hand on his back, and asked whether he had slept well the night before. Micah said he had, then added that he had dreamed about something, but he had forgotten what it was. She asked whether there had been fire trucks in the dream. The boy thought about it very seriously, then said there probably had been. Only after that did she put breakfast on the table. She always did things in that order: ask first, eat afterward, because there were mornings when she needed to hear her son's voice before she could begin anything else. Micah talked while he ate, telling her that his teacher had pinned one of his drawings to the board, and that he wanted to make another one to put over it because the wheels in the old drawing were a little crooked. He asked whether his mother knew how to draw perfectly round wheels. She said she didn't, but she knew how to find a way. The boy nodded immediately, without the slightest doubt. In his eyes, his mother was someone who could fix anything, from a leaking faucet to a jammed door lock, from a shirt torn at the elbow to the nights when he woke up and couldn't breathe evenly. He had never seen his mother fail to fix something. He had also never known that there were nights when she sat in the bathroom and turned the faucet on as loud as it would go. She took him to school, stood watching as he ran into the yard, saw him stop halfway to catch his breath before running again, and stored that detail in her mind, the way a nurse remembers everything, while never allowing any of it to show on her face. That evening, after Micah had fallen asleep, she sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against a cabinet door and opened her phone. She found the recording she had kept for 3 years, the recording she carefully transferred to every new phone before even moving over her contacts. It lasted only a few seconds. Owen's voice filled the dark kitchen, calm, slightly hurried, with the sound of car horns behind him. He said he would be home late. He told her not to wait up. He asked her to kiss their son for him. Then it ended. She played it once more. Not because she needed to remember the words, but because she knew every one of them well enough to speak along with him. She listened because of the way his voice dropped on the final word, the way he spoke as though tomorrow would still be there, as though coming home late was the biggest thing that would happen that night. Then she turned the phone off, laid it face down on her lap, and sat motionless in the darkness. She thought about the hallway the night before, about the man who could have ended everything with a single sentence but had instead told her to go home and sleep. She didn't understand why he had done it. And she had no idea that while she sat there, less than an hour's drive away, someone had already begun typing the name Brennan into a search box. The next morning, she went to work earlier than usual, and on the bus, she opened her phone and checked her inbox once again, exactly as she had done every morning for the past year. There was still nothing new. Her professional license remained there in the same status, described by a phrase that sounded almost gentle, that it was pending review. Legally, she was still allowed to practice. In reality, that mark felt like a streak of red ink stamped across the first page of her life, and every hospital in the state needed only one glance at it. She had applied to the emergency department where she had once worked 3 consecutive shifts without rest. She had applied to the nursing center north of the city, to the community clinic, even to the small nursing home that was always short-staffed. No one rejected her directly. They only said they would be in touch, in exactly the voice of people who already knew they never would. Private home care was the last door still left slightly open, because private employers didn't search the professional databases. They only needed someone who knew the work and was willing to stay awake through the night. So when an elderly woman in Newport called her, Adeline accepted before she even asked how much the job paid. That morning, Rosalie Marchetti was sitting in the room overlooking the bay, pouring her own tea the way she insisted on doing every day. Her hand trembled from the elbow down. The cup touched the saucer with a small sound, tilted, and tea spilled across the tablecloth and ran down the front of her dress. The old woman sat perfectly still. She didn't cry out, didn't reach for a napkin, didn't call anyone. She only looked down at the wet stain spreading across her lap with an expression Adeline had seen hundreds of times in her work. The expression of someone whose own body had just betrayed them in front of another person. Adeline set down her bag and walked over. She didn't reach for a cloth. She didn't say, "It's all right. Let me clean that for you." She picked up the cup, poured fresh tea into it, then placed it back in the old woman's hand. Rosalie looked up at her, and for that moment there was surprise in her face, along with a small spark of anger. Adeline pulled a chair closer and sat beside her, placing 2 fingers lightly beneath Rosalie's wrist, exactly where she knew she could steady the tremor without taking the strength away from the woman's own hand. She told her to lift it normally. She said, "You can do it. I'm only helping you hold steady." Rosalie watched her for another moment, then slowly raised the cup. It was still trembling, but it reached her mouth. She took a sip and lowered it again, and this time the cup touched the saucer almost silently. The old woman didn't say anything for a long while. Then she said that many people had come into this house to care for her, and all of them had been very kind, and all of them had wiped things for her, fed her, buttoned her clothes, until she had almost forgotten that she had once been able to do those things herself. She said Adeline was the first person who had made her drink on her own. Adeline replied that her husband had worked in emergency care, and he used to say that people don't fall apart because they fall. They fall apart because they become afraid of falling again. The old woman nodded slowly. The sunlight had shifted to the edge of the table. She looked out toward the bay for a while, then asked Adeline a question that had nothing to do with tea and nothing to do with trembling hands. She asked whether, if someone had once done something very terrible, and then spent the rest of their life trying to repair it, that person could ever be forgiven. Adeline couldn't see the old woman's hands clenched tightly together beneath the table. She thought Rosalie was talking about her illness, about the tremors, about all the burdens she believed she was placing on other people. So Adeline smiled and told her that she didn't owe anyone anything. Rosalie looked at her for a very long time, then said thank you, and changed the subject. Renzo Bianchi walked into the office in the West Wing in the middle of that afternoon, carrying 2 contracts that needed signatures and a list of the people who would be attending the dinner at the end of the month. He placed everything on the desk and waited, and Salvatore signed each page without reading it again, because Renzo had already read it, and in 10 years, he had never once allowed anything to slip through. When everything was finished, and Renzo had closed the document case, Salvatore finally spoke. He said there was a woman working in the East Wing, and he wanted to know who she was. Renzo's hand stopped. He asked for the name again. Salvatore said Brennan, then added that she worked the night shift, cared for Mrs. Rosalie, and had been there for 6 months. Renzo asked whether something had happened. Salvatore didn't tell him about that night. He only said that someone had managed to enter the East Wing, and he wanted to know everything that could be known about her. Renzo nodded and didn't ask another question. That was why he was still sitting in his position after 10 years. Before he reached the door, Salvatore called him back. He turned his father's ring exactly once around his finger, then said he didn't want her to know about any of this. No questioning anyone in the house, no calling her former employers, no leaving any trace that might make her worry. Renzo said he understood, then walked out. It took him less than 2 days. For a man like Renzo, looking into a medical record and a professional licensing file was no more difficult than making a restaurant reservation, and he had done things far more complicated than that without needing anyone's help. On Thursday afternoon, he carried the file out to his car, sat behind the wheel, closed the door, and intended to drive straight back to Newport. But he didn't start the engine right away. He placed the papers on his lap and looked at them. Outside, The parking lot gradually emptied. The streetlights came on one by one, and rain began tapping lightly against the windshield. Renzo remained still. He was accustomed to bringing bad news back to his employer. He had delivered news about people who betrayed them, money that disappeared, names that should never have appeared on a guest list. He had sat in this very car on the night he had to tell Salvatore that the woman he intended to marry had sold information about him to someone else, and he had told him plainly, without circling around it, without adding a single word to soften the blow. Yet that afternoon, he sat in the car for a very long time, with a thin file resting on his lap. He opened the cover and read the first page, a page with nothing remarkable on it except a date of birth, an address, and one line noting the status of her professional license. Then he turned to the second page. He read all of it. Then he read it a second time, more slowly, his finger stopping somewhere near the middle. After that, he closed the file very carefully and placed it on the passenger seat beside him. The rain grew heavier. Renzo still didn't start the engine. He sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the rain-darkened pavement ahead. And on his face was something no one in the Marchetti house had seen in all the 10 years he had been there. He was hesitating. A very long time passed before he finally reached for the key and turned it. The car left the parking lot and joined the stream of red taillights running along the river, and the file remained closed and silent on the seat beside him for the entire drive back to Newport. The call came near the end of the afternoon shift, just after Adeline had finished preparing Mrs. Rosalie's medication tray. The cardiology clinic told her that the doctor in charge would be leaving for a conference over the weekend, so Micah's follow-up appointment had to be moved up to that evening. And if they missed it, they would have to wait until the next available round. She said thank you, ended the call, then stood still in the middle of the hallway for exactly 1 beat while she calculated. The neighbor could bring the boy there, but Adeline had to be present, because every question the doctor would ask was the kind only she could answer. She asked permission to leave early, changed clothes in less than 2 minutes, then ran toward the gate. From Newport back to the city, the next bus wouldn't arrive for nearly 40 minutes. She opened a ride service app, looked at the amount glowing on the screen, then closed it. That fare was exactly what half a month's worth of her son's medication cost. She slipped the phone into her pocket and started walking quickly toward the main road, hoping she could catch the bus at the stop farther down. She hadn't gone very far when headlights appeared behind her and a car pulled toward the curb, moving slowly beside her. The window came down. Salvatore asked where she was going. She said her son had a doctor's appointment and that she would make it in time. He looked at the empty road ahead, looked at her shoes, then told her to get in. Adeline shook her head. She said she didn't want to trouble him, especially after what had happened that night. Salvatore didn't argue. He simply reached across and opened the passenger door, then returned his hand to the steering wheel and waited. She stood there for 1 more beat before getting into the car. He didn't ask her a single question during the entire drive. He didn't ask what was wrong with her son, didn't ask where the boy's father was, didn't ask why a woman who spent all day caring for other people had to run through the darkness to make it to her own child's doctor. He simply drove, fast but never recklessly, and every time a light turned yellow, he continued through, instead of stopping. Adeline sat with her back straight, both hands resting on the cloth bag in her lap, her eyes turned toward the window, and inside her was a strange feeling, the feeling of someone so accustomed to managing everything alone that she no longer knew what to do when someone quietly helped her. They arrived before the appointment time. She stepped out, thanked him, then hurried inside. In the clinic, Micah was sitting on a high chair with his legs swinging, telling the neighbor about his newest drawing. The examination lasted longer than expected. There was an ultrasound. There were measurements. There were pages printed out and clipped into the medical file. The doctor said the second surgery should be scheduled sooner than originally planned, then handed Adeline a sheet showing the portion of the cost that insurance wouldn't cover. She took the paper, read it, folded it in half, slipped it into her pocket, then asked the doctor her next question in a calm voice, as though she had just read an electricity bill. By the time she led her son back outside, it was almost morning, and Salvatore was still there, sitting on the row of gray plastic chairs in the hallway, his elbows resting on his knees, his coat folded beside him. He hadn't left at all. Adeline stopped short. She couldn't think of a single thing to say. Micah studied him for a moment with the serious concentration of a child trying to place a stranger into the correct place inside his mind. Then he asked, "Are you my mom's friend?" Salvatore opened his mouth, and for the first time in many years, he couldn't find an answer. The boy didn't wait. He added that his mother didn't have any friends, that she only had him. He said it in a completely ordinary voice, without sadness, as though he were simply stating an obvious fact about the weather. Adeline bent down to straighten her son's collar, so no one could see her face. Salvatore stood, picked up his coat, and said he would drive them both home. 3 days later, Salvatore was waiting for her in the downstairs hallway when her shift ended. He told her that he had found out the name of the best surgeon in the region, and that he would take care of the boy's entire operation, including the part insurance wouldn't cover, and all the follow-up care afterward. He said it the way a man might announce the time of a meeting, without the slightest hint that he expected gratitude. Adeline stood still for a very long time. Then she said thank you, and she said she couldn't accept it. Salvatore thought he had misheard her. He asked why. And she answered him with something that left him silent for the rest of that evening. She told him she had grown up in other people's homes. She said she had passed through 4 families before she turned 18, and in every one of those houses she had been fed, clothed, and given a place to sleep, and she knew very well what those things could cost. She told him that once, someone had said the girl ought to be grateful, and that sentence had been repeated every time she did something wrong, every time she came home late, every time she dared to say no. She said that when a person has accepted a meal they have no way to repay, they end up paying for it with a lifetime of obedience, by never daring to argue, by always having to smile even when they don't want to. She said her son would not grow up that way. He would not grow up in a house where his mother had to lower her head to someone because his heart had been healed with that person's money. Salvatore couldn't say anything. He had sat across from some of the most powerful men in the state and had always known what to say next. But standing in that dark hallway that evening, in front of a woman who had just refused the very thing that could save her child, he couldn't find a single sentence. He only nodded and said that he understood. Then he let her leave. But that night he didn't sleep. He sat in his office for a very long time, and what kept him awake wasn't the refusal itself, but the way she had said it. She hadn't been angry at all. She had spoken like someone who had learned that lesson very early, and had paid enough for it never to forget. The next morning, he summoned the family's legal department. He told them to bring out the records of a foundation bearing his mother's name, a foundation his father had created while he was still alive, in the same year Mrs. Rosalie had been hospitalized for the first time. It still existed on paper. Its reports were still filed regularly every year, and it had almost never spent a single dollar on the purpose it had been created to serve, because the approval process had been written by people who had never once had to fill out an application for help in their lives. Salvatore sat and read the regulations from beginning to end. Then he tore the entire thing apart. He ordered them to rewrite it from the beginning, and he set 3 rules. First, the foundation would do only one thing: pay the portion of heart surgery costs for children in the region whose families couldn't afford them. It would not expand into medication, would not expand into living expenses, would not expand into anything else, because a foundation that tried to carry too many things eventually became a foundation that accomplished nothing. Second, the review board had to be completely independent, made up of physicians and 1 attorney appointed from outside, and no one with the Marchetti name would be allowed to sit on it, including him. Third, the application had to be short enough that a mother coming off her shift at midnight could finish it before falling asleep. The lawyer asked whether he wanted to organize a public announcement, because this would be good for the family's image during the sensitive period they were in. Salvatore turned his father's ring once around his finger and said no. He only instructed them to send information about the foundation to every pediatric department and cardiology clinic in the state, on an ordinary sheet of paper, with no logo and no one's name on it. 2 weeks later, Adeline saw that sheet posted on the bulletin board at Micah's clinic, between an advertisement for a yoga class and a notice looking for a babysitter. She stood there and read it twice. She took a copy home, sat down at the kitchen table after her son was asleep, and filled it out like any other mother in the state. She had no idea who had rewritten those rules, and throughout the entire process, Salvatore never once mentioned her name to anyone. Gio Marchetti arrived on a Friday afternoon without warning, the way he had so often done for 40 years in this very house. He embraced his nephew, asked after his sister-in-law's health, and praised the painting hanging at the top of the staircase, in exactly the same words he had used more times than anyone could count. Then he sat down, took a stack of papers folded in half from inside his coat, smoothed them flat, and placed them on the table in front of Salvatore. He didn't say what they were. He only pushed them across. Salvatore opened them. It was a list of names, typed and arranged alphabetically, long enough to continue onto a second page and then a third. Beside each name was a very short note giving the person's job and the number of years they had been doing it. Some had been there since Salvatore's father was still alive. Some had started working there the same year Salvatore was born. He read slowly, through the first page and into the second, and somewhere near the middle his finger stopped. He read the name again to make sure. It belonged to a man who had once worked at the cold storage warehouse by the port. A man with hands large enough to lift Salvatore with one arm. A man who had carried him on his shoulders for an entire afternoon when his father was tied up in meetings and no one else was there to watch him, and who had still remembered to buy him an ice cream before taking him home. Salvatore hadn't thought about that man in many years. He hadn't even known the man still worked out there. Gio sat quietly and let his nephew finish reading. He didn't rush him, didn't explain, didn't give him a single number. He simply waited until Salvatore folded the pages closed. Then he said he hadn't come there to argue, and he hadn't come to ask for anything. He only wanted his nephew to see those names with his own eyes, instead of hearing them reported back in clean language inside a conference room. Then he stood, buttoned his coat again, and before leaving, he said that Salvatore called it honesty, while Gio called it making other people pay for his peaceful sleep. He said it very softly, without any anger, the way an uncle might remind his nephew to put on another layer before going outside. Then he left. Salvatore remained alone with the stack of papers on the table until the room had gone completely dark. He didn't turn on the lights. That night, while passing the east wing, he saw Adeline sitting on the hallway steps with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, waiting for the time to give Mrs. Rosalie her medication. He stopped. He hadn't intended to talk, but for some reason he sat down a short distance away and asked whether, in her line of work, she had ever been forced to do something she knew was right, even though it hurt someone else. Adeline thought for a while. Then she told him about a man she had once cared for during the final weeks of his life. A man with 4 children, all 4 of whom wanted treatment to continue, even though everyone knew that each new treatment only prolonged his suffering rather than his life. She said she had to sit down with each child separately and tell them the thing none of them wanted to hear. Then she said, the hardest part wasn't deciding to stop. The hardest part was knowing that stopping would still hurt and having to stop anyway. When she finished, she stood, excused herself, and went inside because it was time for the medication. Salvatore remained alone on the steps for a very long time. She had no idea what she had just spoken about. She didn't know that on the desk behind him lay a stack of papers with names arranged in alphabetical order, and she didn't know that one of those names belonged to a man who had once carried him on his shoulders during an afternoon he himself had long since forgotten. Camilla Voss arrived on Tuesday morning, under the pretense of discussing the guest list for the upcoming fundraiser, carrying 2 folders and the easy confidence of someone who had been coming in and out of this house since she was still in school. Adeline was carrying a medication tray past the living room at the time. Salvatore was there, along with Camilla, the housekeeper, and a young woman who had only started working there the week before. Camilla watched Adeline for a moment, then turned and said loudly enough for everyone to hear that she found it strange for someone with a red mark on her professional record to be allowed in and out of Mrs. Rosalie's bedroom, and that a nurse under investigation ought to know very clearly where she stood. She said it in a light, almost friendly voice, the kind of voice that made it impossible for anyone to react without being made to look overly sensitive. Adeline paused for half a beat, then kept walking. She didn't turn around, didn't answer, didn't drop a single pill from the tray. The housekeeper lowered his eyes. The young woman who had just started looked down at the floor. Salvatore said nothing. He didn't defend Adeline, didn't interrupt Camilla, didn't change his expression. He only looked at Camilla Voss for a very long time, longer than normal, and no one in the room noticed that his finger had just turned his father's ring exactly once. Then he returned to the documents and asked her about the guest list as though nothing had happened. Camilla left believing she had just scored a point. 4 days later, the Voss family lost its equipment supply contracts with 2 hospitals in the region and a renovation contract in the Port District. On the 5th day, they received notice that the family's seat on the board of the city's charitable organization, a seat they had held continuously for 2 decades, would be transferred at the next meeting. Not one document mentioned the Marchetti name. No one called to explain. Everything happened smoothly, entirely according to procedure, and it was precisely that obedience to procedure that made it frightening. That evening, Camilla's father called. Salvatore answered on the second ring. He let the man say everything he wanted to say. The man began by reminding him that their two families had done business together since Salvatore's father's time, then shifted into familiarity, then reproach, and finally into the voice of someone trying desperately to hold on to something he could feel slipping away. He asked what this was really about. Salvatore waited until the other end had gone completely silent. Then he told the man to teach his daughter how to address other people with basic respect. He said only that one sentence, without raising his voice, without explaining another word, then ended the call and placed the phone face down on the table. Adeline knew absolutely nothing about any of it. The next morning, she still arrived on time, still warmed the towels before washing Mrs. Rosalie still believed the remark from the day before was simply one more among countless things she had learned to swallow and keep walking past. That same evening, Renzo entered the office carrying the file. He had been holding on to it for nearly a week. Salvatore looked up and asked what he had found. Renzo placed the file on the edge of the desk but didn't push it across, and didn't open it. He said her name was Adeline Brennan, that she had grown up in foster care, studied nursing, then worked in an emergency department, that her husband had died 3 years earlier, and that she had a young son. He said her professional license was under review because of a medication error she most likely hadn't caused. Salvatore asked whether there was anything else. Renzo was silent for exactly 1 beat. Then he said, "Clean. Nothing else." Salvatore nodded and returned to the papers in front of him, because in 10 years he had never once needed to verify the word of this man. Renzo picked up the file and walked out. When he reached the hallway, he stopped there for a very long time, his hand gripping the cover tightly, and the second page remained inside, untouched, with not a single word of it ever spoken aloud. That Saturday, the neighbor came down with a cold, and Adeline had a shift she couldn't trade with anyone. She thought about calling in and asking for the day off, picked up the phone, then set it down again, until Mrs. Rosalie heard what was happening and told her to bring the boy along, because this house was so large that the sound of a child's voice hadn't echoed through it in years. So that morning, Micah came to Newport carrying a box of colored pencils and a pad of white paper, after being carefully instructed that he was to sit quietly in the staff kitchen and not wander around. He managed to sit still for about an hour. Then he went looking for his mother, made the wrong turn at the second corner, and found himself lost in a long hallway lined with doors that all looked exactly alike. Salvatore found him standing in the middle of that hallway, holding the pad of paper against his chest, looking remarkably calm for a child who had gotten lost. He asked whether Micah was all right. Micah said he was only trying to remember where he had turned earlier. Salvatore led him back down to the kitchen, and he should have gone on with his own work after that. But the boy opened his pad of paper and asked whether he knew how to draw perfectly round wheels. Salvatore sat down. He pulled out a chair, rolled up his sleeves, took the colored pencil the boy handed him, and began to color. He couldn't remember the last time he had held a crayon or colored pencil in his hand. Micah assigned him the body of the fire truck and kept the ladder for himself because, according to him, the ladder was harder. They worked in silence for a while, very seriously, both heads bent over the same sheet of paper. Then the boy looked up, examined Salvatore's work, and stopped coloring. He said, "You used the wrong color." Salvatore looked down. He had colored the truck a deep red that leaned toward brown, the shade in the box he found most pleasing to look at. Micah shook his head and explained with great patience, like a skilled craftsman teaching an apprentice, that fire trucks weren't that color. They had to be bright red, red enough for people to see from very far away, because if people couldn't see them from far away, they would arrive too late. He searched through the box, pulled out the exact pencil he wanted, placed it in Salvatore's hand, then told him he could color over it. That coloring over it was fine. Salvatore took the new pencil and colored over what he had already done. Micah nodded in satisfaction and returned to his ladder. Adeline stood in the doorway and watched them. She had been standing there for a while, still holding a towel she had just folded, and she didn't step inside. She watched the man whose name this entire city only dared to speak, in a whisper sitting bent over a sheet of white paper, being corrected by a 6-year-old boy, and obediently starting his work over again. She watched her son speak to him in the completely natural voice of a child who had never learned that there were certain people one was supposed to fear. And then she realized that something inside her chest was growing strangely warm, a feeling she couldn't name and didn't want to name. That was when she became afraid. Not of him. She was afraid of herself. She was afraid of the part of her that stood there and found the scene beautiful, the part already quietly wondering whether there might be another morning like this one someday. She knew exactly who she was in this house. She knew about the file hanging over her head. She knew that women like her, when they finally allowed themselves to dream, were often the ones who fell the hardest. She remained there for one more beat, then stepped backward, walked down the hallway, and neither of the two people in the kitchen ever knew she had been standing there. That afternoon, when mother and son left, Micah carried the drawing with him and proudly told his mother that the man had used the wrong color at first, but he had fixed it very quickly, and that his latter coloring wasn't too bad either. Her proposal was approved on a Thursday afternoon, and the person who called with the news was a doctor on the independent review board, someone she had never met. She had submitted it nearly 2 months earlier, a home care plan for elderly people who couldn't afford to enter a nursing facility, written out by hand and then typed after Micah had fallen asleep. In it, she proposed flexible shifts for nurses who were single mothers, transportation for overnight staff, and free training for people who didn't have formal qualifications, but had spent years caring for members of their own families. The board told her it was the only proposal they had received that had been written by someone who truly understood what a night shift meant. When the official document was printed, her name appeared on the first page beneath the line identifying the person who had designed the program. She read that line more times than she wanted to admit. The fundraiser was held at the end of the month in a large hall overlooking the harbor. Adeline bought a dress from a second-hand store and altered the waist herself so it would fit. Micah told his mother she looked like someone from a movie, and he reminded her to stand up straight. She arrived before the scheduled time, stood near the edge of the room, with one hand holding her small purse, and searched for quite a while before she finally found the group of colleagues she knew. During the first half hour, she felt almost happy. People shook her hand. One doctor told her he had read her proposal twice. Someone called her Mrs. Brennan instead of calling her the nurse. Camilla Voss arrived a little later. She made her way around the room, greeting each group, and as she went, she handed 3 members of the foundation board a thin packet of papers, saying this was something the organizers should have reviewed before printing someone's name on the cover. It was a copy of the investigation into Adeline's professional license, along with the note showing that its status was still pending. Camilla said nothing more. She simply handed it over, smiled, and moved on to the next group. But that packet wasn't the only thing she had brought with her that night. During the previous several weeks, someone inside the Marchetti household had helped her review the security logs from the East Wing, and among those records was one unusual entry. The access card registered to Mrs. Rosalie had been used to enter the East Wing close to midnight, on the exact night when Salvatore's official schedule showed that he was supposed to be in Montreal. Camilla didn't need anyone to tell her what had happened. She needed only that single entry, one name, and an imagination that knew how to arrange facts in whatever way served her best. So when she began telling the story, she said the nurse had waited until the house was empty, borrowed the access card of a sick elderly woman to enter the owner's private rooms, undressed, and climbed into his bathtub, and carefully arranged things so that he would catch her there at exactly the right moment when he came home. She told it in a sympathetic voice, occasionally adding that it was almost sad, because after all, who wouldn't want a chance to change their life? The story traveled faster than the wine. Adeline realized what was happening in the way every woman eventually learns to recognize it, through the silences. She walked toward one group and they stopped talking. She passed another and heard a quiet laugh behind her. A woman wearing a pearl necklace turned and asked whether the bathroom in Newport was really as impressive as everyone said, then laughed, and several people around her laughed too. Adeline stood still, all the blood drained from her face. For a moment, she could hear running water inside her head, hear the door opening, and she understood that the most humiliating night of her life had just been turned into entertainment for a room full of strangers. She turned and looked for him. Salvatore was standing not far away among a group of investors, and he had heard it. He looked at her. She looked back at him, and she waited. She waited for the thing she had been certain would come, because she had seen him stand up for his mother, had seen him sit through the entire night on a plastic chair outside a hospital room, had seen him bend over a drawing and recolor a fire truck, because a little boy told him the red was wrong. She waited for him to step forward and say something. He didn't. He stood there, and for 3 seconds, the man who never hesitated. For those 3 seconds, he thought about the unsigned transfer agreement, about the people standing around him, about how one careless sentence now could turn her private humiliation into news across the entire city by morning. 3 seconds, in his life, was only a breath. To Adeline, those 3 seconds were as long as the entire year she had spent living beneath the red mark on her professional record. And when the 3rd second passed and he still hadn't spoken, something inside her quietly went dark. She didn't cry. That was the thing Salvatore would remember most clearly afterward. Adeline simply lifted a hand to her chest, removed the name badge that identified her as the person who had designed the program, placed it on the white-covered table beside the untouched wine glasses, then turned and walked toward the door. She didn't hurry. She didn't bump into anyone. She walked straight through the middle of the people who had just laughed at her, her back straight, her head held high, exactly as her son had told her, and not one person in that room had enough decency to call her back. It was raining outside. She walked down the steps and went straight into the rain without stopping to put on anything warmer. Inside, Salvatore stood watching the door close behind her. Then he turned toward the sound technician and signaled for the music to stop. The entire hall fell silent. He stepped onto the platform without carrying any notes, and without waiting for anyone to introduce him. He said that a story about the private life of an employee had been repeated in this room tonight, and it had been twisted until not one word of it remained true. Then he told them exactly what had happened. He said that his mother had been the one who gave Adeline the access card, that Mrs. Rosalie was the owner of that card, and had every right to decide who could enter. He said that when he asked who had given her the card, Adeline answered that no one had, that she had gone in on her own, because she would rather lose her job than allow an elderly woman to be blamed. He said that night, before stepping into the hallway to face him, she had cleaned the room down to the smallest detail, and she had asked to repay everything she had used, even if she had to pay it back little by little every week. He said that he had lived in his own house for 34 years, and had never met anyone who admitted being wrong the way she had. No one in the hall moved. Then he said that the shameful thing tonight wasn't that an exhausted woman had lain in a bathtub of warm water for 10 minutes. The shameful thing was that a room full of people who had never had to worry about money had taken those 10 minutes and turned them into a joke. He turned toward the Voss family and said that every relationship between their two families ended tonight. And he said it in the same quiet voice that everyone in the room understood, left no room for negotiation. Camilla stood there with her wine glass still in her hand, her face drained white. Several people reached for their phones. Others lowered their heads. Salvatore stepped down from the platform and went straight to the door without saying goodbye to anyone. He ran down the steps into the rain, across the parking lot, and all the way to the bus stop at the corner. It was empty. There was only a soaked metal bench and a crooked timetable posted beneath the shelter. He called her. Her phone was off. He called again. Still off. He stood there in the rain with the phone in his hand, water running down the collar of his shirt, and for the first time in many years he understood that there were some things in his life that couldn't be fixed by speaking louder than everyone else, and couldn't be fixed with a phone call. He had said everything that needed to be said. He had simply said it 3 seconds later than he should have, and those 3 seconds would take him a very long time to understand the full cost of. She returned to Newport on Monday morning, deliberately choosing the hour when she knew Salvatore would be in a meeting in the city, carrying her uniform washed clean and folded flat inside a paper bag. She intended to leave it with a short note of thanks for the housekeeper, and then go immediately. But Mrs. Rosalie was asleep, and while she waited, Adeline finished one last task she had done every morning for the past 6 months, preparing the medication tray for noon. The medicine box was kept in a drawer of the old woman's writing desk. She pulled the drawer open, and beneath the medicine box was a half-finished sheet of paper. The handwriting trembled so badly that some words had been written twice, and the entire page held fewer than 10 lines, something a healthy person could have finished in 2 minutes. She should have folded it and put it back exactly where she found it. But her eyes had already caught a name somewhere near the middle of the page. Owen Brennan. She stood completely still in that room for a very long time. Then she picked up the paper and read from the beginning. The old woman had written that she had meant to tell Adeline this from the very first day, that she had known who Adeline was before she ever walked into this house, that she had seen the name Brennan on a list 3 years earlier and had never been able to forget it. The next sentence stopped halfway through, the ink spreading where the pen had rested too long against the paper. Adeline read it a second time, then a third, and she didn't believe it. She thought about the tremors, about the afternoons when the old woman confused people's names, about all the times she had watched a memory beginning to fracture. She told herself that perhaps Mrs. Rosalie was confused, that perhaps it was another name, that there were countless people in the world with the surname Brennan. She placed the paper back exactly where it had been, closed the drawer, finished preparing the medication tray, left her uniform on the chair, then went home. She tried to believe that explanation for the entire bus ride. But that evening, after Micah had fallen asleep, she put on her coat and walked to the city's central library, which stayed open late and kept photographic archives of every local newspaper. She sat down in front of the microfilm reader, entered the month and year she would never forget, and began going through the pages one by one. She found the report on page 4 of the following day's edition. A warehouse in the Port District had caught fire before dawn. 3 people had died. One of them was an emergency medical worker. She had read that report before, 3 years earlier, so many times that she knew it by heart. But this time she didn't read that part. Her eyes moved down to the final line. The line naming the company that owned the building, the line she had passed over 3 years earlier, because at the time, there had been no room left in her mind for anything except figuring out how to survive the next day. She read it. Then she sat completely still. She kept searching. She found the report announcing the conclusion of the investigation, published 4 months later. No more than a short paragraph buried in the middle of a page, stating that the cause had been determined to be an electrical short circuit and that the case had been closed. She remembered very clearly that she had appealed twice. The first time, they answered with a printed form letter. The second time, someone called and told her, very politely, that she should save her strength for her son. She remembered sitting on the kitchen floor after that call and thinking that perhaps they were right. Now, beneath the yellow light of the archive room, she looked at the name of the company that owned the building once again, and everything inside her turned cold. For 6 months, she had bathed an elderly woman. She had fed her spoonful by spoonful. She had held her wrist so she could drink her first cup of tea on her own after months of being unable to do it. She had called her by her first name on afternoons when the two of them were alone. She had sat on the steps of their house and told their son about a patient at the end of his life. She had allowed her own son to sit coloring in their kitchen. She stood up, and afterward she couldn't remember how she had walked home. The next morning, she wrote her resignation letter. It was very short and very polite, thanking them for the opportunity she had been given and asking to complete the handover during the week. There wasn't a single word in it about the fundraiser, not a single word about those 3 seconds, not a single word about the name she had just discovered. She returned to Newport one final time, went directly upstairs to the room overlooking the bay, and placed the letter on the table beside the neatly folded uniform she had left there the day before. The message came on Wednesday afternoon from a number she had never saved. It contained only one line, the name of a cemetery south of the city and a time, with no greeting and no signature. Adeline stared at it for a long while before she understood who had sent it. Renzo Bianchi had stood only a few steps away from her in that house for 6 months, and had never spoken more than 3 sentences to her. And now he said nothing more, because there were some truths a man like him didn't have enough courage to say himself. He had only opened a door for her, then stepped back. She arrived before the appointed time and stood behind a row of trees beside the path, in a place where she could see Owen's grave without anyone being able to see her. The air had already begun to turn cold. Salvatore came alone, without a driver and without anyone accompanying him. He wore a dark coat, carried no flowers, and walked directly to the correct row of graves like a man who had looked up the location beforehand. He stopped in front of the headstone. He didn't bow his head. He didn't make the sign of the cross. He simply stood there with both hands hanging at his sides, and for a very long time he did nothing at all. Then he began to speak. His voice was quiet, but the cemetery was so still that afternoon that Adeline could hear every word. He said he hadn't known Owen was there that night. He said that by the time he learned the truth about that warehouse, everything had been over for a long time, and the case had already been closed. He said he had spent the past 3 years taking things apart one piece at a time, and he still wasn't finished. Then he fell silent for a while. After that, he said the sentence Adeline would hear again inside her head for many nights afterward. He said that building belonged to his family, so what happened there belonged to him. He said he hadn't come here to ask for anything. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, because he knew he had no right to ask, and because the only person who had the right to forgive him was already lying beneath this ground. He said he had come to repay. Then he said that Owen's wife was the strongest woman he had ever met, and that he had been given the chance to stand up for her in front of a room full of people. And he had hesitated. He said it without offering a single excuse. He only said that he had hesitated, and that he would never be able to explain to himself why. Then he said he would take care of the boy, not by putting his mother in anyone's debt, but by building things that children like him had a right to receive, even if they didn't know anyone important. When he finished speaking, he stood there a little longer. Then he placed one hand lightly on the top edge of the headstone, only once, the way someone might rest a hand on the shoulder of a person they had never met. After that, he turned and walked away. Adeline remained behind the trees. She had come there carrying enough anger to burn everything down, anger she had fed since the night at the library, and she had prepared every sentence she meant to say if she saw him. But she didn't step out. She stayed where she was until the sound of his car had disappeared completely, and only then did she walk to her husband's grave and sit down on the damp grass. She sat there for a very long time without saying anything to him at all, because for the first time in 3 years, she didn't know what she was supposed to say. Adeline's home care program continued even after she left Newport, because it belonged to the independent board rather than to anyone in the Marchetti family, and because she had signed the contract before that fundraiser ever took place. She moved into the work full-time at a rented 2-story house on the west side of the city that had been renovated into a daytime center for elderly people in the neighborhood. Every morning, several old women with canes came there to practice walking along colored tape lines that Adeline herself had placed on the floor, and one elderly man came only to sit with a cup of coffee and tell the same story about the years when he had worked at the shipyard. On Tuesday morning, when she opened the door, 3 black cars were parked along the other side of the street, directly across from the building. The windows were dark, the engines still running. No one got out. No one did anything. They remained there all morning, then left. On Wednesday morning, they came back, in exactly the same place and at exactly the same time. Adeline said nothing to anyone. She only drew the curtains and told everyone they would exercise in the back room that day. But one of the elderly women asked who those cars belonged to, and something in the woman's voice made Adeline understand that people were beginning to feel afraid. By Thursday morning, 2 people had stopped coming altogether. Renzo was the one who reported it to Salvatore, and he included the license plate numbers. The 3 cars belonged to a faction everyone in the family knew was taking orders from someone in particular. Salvatore didn't call his uncle. He didn't take anyone with him either. That afternoon, he drove to a residential neighborhood on the north side, found the right small house with white painted front steps, and knocked on the door. The man who answered was very young, his face still carrying the uncertainty of someone who had been in the business for less than a year. He went pale when he recognized the person standing outside his home. Inside, his wife was preparing dinner. Salvatore said he would only stay for a moment. The young woman invited him in, nervously poured him a glass of water, then retreated into the kitchen. He sat down at their dining table among the plates already set for dinner and drank the entire glass of water slowly without saying anything. The young man remained standing because he didn't dare sit down. Only after Salvatore set the glass on the table did he speak, and he spoke so quietly that the woman in the kitchen couldn't hear a single word. He said, "You parked outside a place where elderly women with canes come every morning to practice walking. In the past 3 days, 2 of them have become too frightened to come back. Both of those women are over 80 years old, and they go there because it's the only place in this neighborhood where someone greets them every morning." Then he said, "You go back and tell my uncle this. What happens at the port stays at the port. What happens between men gets settled between men. But if anyone comes near that door again, I won't speak to him. I'll speak to the person paying him." When he finished, Salvatore stood. He turned toward the kitchen, thanked the young wife for the glass of water, told her that dinner smelled good, then walked out. The young man remained exactly where he was until the sound of the car had faded away. The next morning, when Adeline opened the door and pulled back the curtains, the street across from her was completely empty. There wasn't a single car there. The 2 elderly women who had stayed away for 3 days returned the following Monday carrying a box of homemade cookies. Adeline never learned why the 3 cars had disappeared. She only assumed that whoever they belonged to had grown bored, or had found somewhere better to park. And several miles away, in a room in Newport, Gio Marchetti listened to every word his nephew had said, then sat in silence for a very long time. He wasn't angry. He simply understood that the gentler path had closed, and that next time he would have to aim at something his nephew couldn't stop by knocking on someone's front door. The letter arrived on a Friday morning, printed on the insurance company's letterhead, fully signed and properly stamped. Its message was very short and very polite. After reviewing its risk portfolio, the company had decided not to renew the facility's liability insurance, and the current policy would terminate at the end of the month. Adeline read it twice, then sat down. Without liability insurance, the center couldn't legally remain open. That wasn't anyone's personal rule. It was the law. She called the company and was transferred to 3 different people, every one of whom gave her the same answer: that the decision had come from higher up, and they were very sorry. She called 2 other companies. One promised to call back and never did. The other quoted a premium 4 times higher, with the additional condition that the facility obtain a guarantee from a sufficiently large legal entity. She sat alone in the empty room, looking at the colored strips of tape she had placed across the floor, and understood that no one had broken a single law. Someone had simply pulled one leg out from under the chair, very gently, and let the chair fall on its own. That same morning in Newport, Renzo placed another set of papers on Salvatore's desk. He had traced the call that led to the cancellation decision, and it hadn't come from Salvatore's uncle or from anyone connected to the Port faction. It had come from an old acquaintance on the insurance company's board, and the person who had arranged that call was Camilla Voss. Salvatore didn't look surprised, but Renzo wasn't finished. He turned to the next section and said that when he traced things farther back, he discovered that Camilla Voss hadn't started doing this last month. She had been doing it for 3 years. Every one of Salvatore's travel schedules, every meeting with legitimate business partners, every step in the transition process that he had believed only he and Renzo knew about, had passed through her before reaching Gio Marchetti. She was the one who told him whom Salvatore was meeting in Montreal. She was the one who helped him read the East Wing security logs. Salvatore sat without moving for a very long time, and in that silence, everything began falling into its proper place. He had thought Camilla Voss was jealous. He had thought the remark she made in the living room that day was nothing more than the petty cruelty of a woman accustomed to being indulged, and he had answered it in exactly the way one answered petty cruelty. But now he understood that she had never truly been aiming at Adeline. Adeline had only been a tool. What Camilla Voss wanted wasn't a place beside him. She wanted to damage his credibility at the most sensitive moment possible, when he needed legitimate partners to trust him, and when every set of eyes inside the family was waiting for him to stumble. A man caught in a scandal involving a woman employed in his own house would no longer have the standing to speak about decency or honest business. All it took was one story told at the right time, in the right place, among exactly the right people. And they had told it on the night he had invited every important person into the same room. Salvatore rose and walked to the window. He turned his father's ring around his finger, once, then twice. He thought about Adeline's face in the ballroom that night, about the way she had turned her head to find him, and waited. She had never known that she was standing in the middle of someone else's war. She had simply been the only woman in that room with nothing to lose except her own dignity, and that was exactly why they had chosen her. Renzo asked how he wanted to handle it. Salvatore didn't turn around. He said that first, he needed another name, the name of the person inside the house who had read the security logs and passed them outside. For nearly a year, Gio Marchetti had been searching for a traitor. He was certain that someone inside the family was feeding records to outsiders because the federal authorities knew too much, knew things only a handful of people in the world could possibly know, knew even about events that had taken place while his older brother was still alive. He had investigated every branch, cut off contact with 2 people he suspected, spent night after night sitting with a notebook and a pen, crossing out names one by one. He never found the traitor because he had never once written that name in the notebook. The person who had turned over the entire record of the Marchetti family's operations was Salvatore. He had done it 2 years earlier, alone, without going through the family attorneys, without even telling Renzo until much later. He had brought them everything, holding nothing back for himself, including the things he had done with his own hands during the years when he was young and still believed there was only one way the world could work. He hadn't asked for immunity. He hadn't traded the information for mercy for himself. What he had traded for was an agreement, and that agreement came with conditions. Every old operation at the port had to be converted into legitimate business, fully documented, independently audited, and every person whose name appeared on the list his uncle had placed on the table that day had to keep their job, with a real contract, real insurance, and their real name. If that transition was completed, everyone under his authority would be protected from prosecution, and they would step into a life where they no longer had to look over their shoulders every time they walked out the door. If it wasn't completed, the agreement would collapse. Salvatore wouldn't be the only one to go down. They would all go down together, one name at a time, from the warehouse manager to the forklift driver, from the dock worker who had once carried him on his shoulders, to people he had never even met. All of those lives were tied to a single signature, to one transfer scheduled for the final morning of the month, when the last branches would be handed over to a legitimate company and the file would finally close. That was why, for 2 years, Salvatore had never allowed himself to lose his temper, had never let anyone drag him into an argument, had never retaliated loudly. He had no right to lose anywhere before that day arrived. And that was also what had held him still, for exactly 3 seconds in the ballroom that night. 3 seconds he would carry for the rest of his life, because in those 3 seconds he had weighed one woman against 400 people, and he had forgotten that there are some things that must never be placed on a scale. That evening, he drove to Fox Point. Adeline opened the door and didn't invite him inside right away. She stood in the doorway blocking his path, still holding a dish towel in one hand, and told him that she had gone to the cemetery on Wednesday, that she had stood behind the trees and heard everything. Salvatore offered no defense. He only nodded. Then she asked why he had come tonight. He said he had come to tell her something even his own uncle didn't know. He told her everything, briefly, without embellishment, without using the word sacrifice even once. He told her about the records he had turned over, about the conditions of the agreement, about the transfer at the end of the month, about how if that signature wasn't placed on the page on the appointed day, every name on that list would fall at once. He said that after everything was completed, there would be a part that belonged to him alone, and he didn't know how heavy that part would be. Adeline listened to all of it. She stood there for a very long time, and in her mind she saw the man who had spent an entire night sitting on a plastic chair outside a hospital room, who had bent over a drawing and recolored a fire truck because a child told him the red was wrong, who had stood before her husband's grave and said he hadn't come to ask for anything. She asked him what he wanted from her. Salvatore said he hadn't come to ask for forgiveness, because he knew those 3 seconds weren't something an apology could undo. He said he wasn't asking her to wait either, because he had no right to ask anyone to suspend their life for something uncertain. Then he said one final thing, very quietly, and it was the only sentence that entire evening in which his voice failed to remain steady. He said he was only asking her not to think that he had walked away. Adeline didn't answer. She looked at him for one more moment, then stepped back and closed the door. But she didn't lock it, and Salvatore stood outside in that dark hallway for a long time before finally walking down the stairs. The winter storm swept into the Rhode Island coast that afternoon, and by evening the wind had grown strong enough to bend the trees along the Newport Point almost flat in one direction. Adeline wasn't supposed to be there, but the night nurse called to say she couldn't make it because the roads were flooded, and the housekeeper called Adeline, not as someone speaking for an employer, but as a frightened older woman, saying that Mrs. Rosalie had 3 medications that had to be injected at exact times that night, and there was no one left in the house who knew how to do it. Adeline had stopped working there nearly a month earlier. She had told herself she would never return to that house again, but she took Micah to the neighbor's apartment, told him to go to bed early, and promised she would come get him in the morning, then put on her coat and caught the last bus heading south. She arrived close to 9 o'clock that evening. The only people still in the house were the housekeeper, a young maid, and Renzo. Salvatore was in the city with the lawyers, completing the final pages of the transfer documents that were supposed to be signed the next morning. Adeline went upstairs to Mrs. Rosalie's room, checked her blood pressure, inspected the oxygen concentrator, prepared the medication, and Mrs. Rosalie gripped her hand very tightly when she saw her walk in. She couldn't say much. She only held Adeline's hand. Salvatore returned home close to 11 o'clock, his clothes soaked through, carrying the case that held the contracts. He stopped short when he saw her in the hallway. Neither of them had time to say a single word before the lights went out. They didn't flicker the way they usually did during storm outages. They went out once, completely and decisively, throughout the entire house at the same moment. And 2 seconds later, the backup generator failed to start. Renzo went outside to check and came back within 3 minutes, rainwater streaming down his face, and said that both the electrical box and the generator had been opened and shut off by hand. He added that the only road leading away from the point had been blocked by 3 trucks parked across it, their lights off, their drivers still sitting inside the cabs. No one could get out, and no one could get in. Gio Marchetti walked through the front door less than 10 minutes later, brushing rain from the shoulders of his coat and greeting the housekeeper in the same familiar voice she had heard for 40 years. He brought no one into the house with him. He simply walked straight to the dining room, pulled out his usual chair at the head of the table, sat down, and placed a pen in front of himself. Then he looked at his nephew and said that he hadn't come to hurt anyone. He had come to talk, and he had all night. He said the contracts inside that case weren't going anywhere until morning, and that tomorrow morning, if they weren't where they were supposed to be, everything would return to the way it had been before, and no one would have to lose anything. He said all of it calmly beneath the candlelight the housekeeper had just lit, one hand resting on the wooden table where he had eaten with his brother hundreds of times. Salvatore didn't argue. He knew his uncle hadn't lied about a single thing. Gio didn't need to hit anyone. He didn't need to threaten anyone. He only needed time to pass. That was when the young maid came running down the stairs, terrified, calling for Miss Brennan. Adeline was already running upstairs before the girl could finish the sentence. In Mrs. Rosalie's room, the oxygen concentrator had stopped working when the power went out, its indicator light completely dark, and the old woman was propped against the pillows, breathing shallowly and rapidly. Adeline turned on the flashlight on her phone, dropped to her knees beside the bed, and within seconds she understood what was happening. Mrs. Rosalie wasn't simply short of oxygen, something else was happening. And it was happening very quickly. Adeline called emergency services. Her phone showed no signal. She tried again. Still nothing. She ran into the hallway, held the phone high above her head, walked from one end to the other, and everywhere she went there was nothing but an empty signal bar. The storm had knocked out the local transmission tower earlier that afternoon, and no one had noticed because no one in the house had needed to call anyone all evening. Renzo managed to reach someone on the main road by radio, and the man said an ambulance could arrive in about 20 minutes, but only if the single road leading onto the point was cleared. The 3 trucks were still parked across it, their lights off, unmoving. Adeline went back into the bedroom, raised the pillows higher, loosened the collar around the old woman's neck, and Mrs. Rosalie found her hand in the darkness and held on to it. Her hand was cold. Downstairs, beneath the candlelight, Gio Marchetti was still sitting beside his pen, and he had no idea what was happening on the floor above. They brought the old woman downstairs, because the dining room was the only place where candles were still burning, and the room closest to the front door, and if the ambulance managed to reach them, every single step would matter. Adeline knelt on the cold tile floor, rested Mrs. Rosalie's head in her lap, and turned her face gently to one side. She raised the flashlight on her phone and shone it into the old woman's eyes, covering and uncovering them, covering and uncovering them, and she saw the thing she had feared most, that one pupil wasn't constricting to the light the way the other one was. She took both of the old woman's hands and told her to squeeze. The right hand responded weakly, while the left barely responded at all. Adeline looked at the clock on the wall and fixed that time in her memory, because in her profession, that time was the most important thing she could carry to the doctors. The housekeeper stood beside her with both hands clasped together. Renzo held the radio to his ear and shook his head. The 3 trucks were still blocking the only road out, their lights off. Salvatore stood at the head of the dining table, looking down at his mother lying on the floor of her own home. Then he opened the case. He took out the transfer agreement, the entire thick stack of papers he had traded 3 years of his life to obtain, the documents in which every page represented a name preserved, a family that wouldn't have to leave this state, a promise on which he had wagered the rest of his life. He placed it on the table in front of his uncle, directly beside the pen. He said, "You want this. Here it is. Take it. Sign in my place if you want. Tear it apart if you want. I won't stop you. Move the trucks now." Gio Marchetti looked at the papers in front of him. All his life, he had waited for a moment like this. A moment when the thing he wanted was within reach, and the other man was the one forced to surrender. He reached out and touched the cover of the file. That was when Adeline looked up. She was still kneeling on the floor, one hand supporting the old woman's head. Her hair stuck to her temples, and she looked directly at the man sitting at the head of the dining table. She told him that he had very little time before part of his sister-in-law's brain died permanently, and once that part was gone, it would never come back, no matter what he did afterward. She said she didn't care what he signed, whom he defeated, or what he managed to win tonight. She said she needed those 3 trucks off that road right now. Then she said one final thing, and her voice didn't tremble. "If you want to beat your nephew, then beat him. But don't win by using the woman who took care of you when you were still a child." The entire room fell into a silence none of them would ever be able to describe afterward. Salvatore said nothing more. He knew anything he said now would only make his uncle more stubborn, and for the first time in his life, he accepted standing still and allowing someone else to speak for him. Gio Marchetti remained seated for a very long time. He looked at the woman kneeling on the floor, then down at the face of the woman lying in her lap. The woman who had married his brother in a summer that felt impossibly far away, who had cooked for him through the years when he had nothing, who had defended him to his father when he was still a troublesome boy. Then he did something no one in the room expected. He pushed the file back toward his nephew. He pushed it with both hands, firmly, and didn't look at it again. He stood, pulled the radio from the pocket of his coat, and ordered all 3 trucks moved off the road immediately. He gave the command once, and didn't repeat it. Then he took off his coat and draped it over the back of a chair, walked to the front door, threw it wide open into the wind and rain, and stood outside on the steps with a light raised so the ambulance could find its way in. When the stretcher was wheeled out, he was the one who lifted one end of it, that 61-year-old man standing in the rain without saying a word. He walked beside the stretcher, all the way to the ambulance door. Before the doors closed, he bent down and looked at his sister-in-law's face once, very quickly, then stepped back. Adeline climbed into the ambulance with the old woman. Salvatore climbed in after her, and when the ambulance rolled away from the point, the stack of transfer documents was still lying untouched on the dining table beneath the half-burned candles, and no one had bothered to bring it with them. Near dawn, the doctor came out and told them they had intervened in time, that if they had been delayed by that same amount of time, the outcome would have been different, and that the exact time Adeline had remembered was what allowed them to make the decision so quickly. Salvatore sat down on the row of chairs outside the room and said nothing for a very long while. Gio Marchetti arrived just as the sky was beginning to brighten. He didn't ask anyone anything. He simply walked down the hallway, found his nephew, and sat in the chair beside him. The 2 men remained silent like that for a while. Then Gio began to speak, and no one forced him to. He spoke about a warehouse at the port 3 years earlier, a warehouse that had outlived its usefulness and had been insured for far more than it was actually worth. He said he had given the order. He said he had planned everything, chosen the middle of the night, chosen an area where no one was supposed to be passing through. But when the man assigned to the job arrived, he discovered that 2 people were sleeping inside. Homeless people who had crawled into the building to escape the cold. The man didn't dare disobey the order, because in that world people didn't disobey orders, but he also couldn't bring himself to remain silent. So before doing what he had been sent there to do, he made an anonymous emergency call from a payphone on the street, reported that someone was in danger, then hung up and discarded the number he had used. Gio said that for his entire life he had told himself that if no one had come that night, then the blame would have belonged to the man who made that call. But someone did come. A young emergency medical worker received the call and arrived before the fire department. He went inside and brought both people out, one at a time. He had already made it outside. He was already safe. Then he heard a dog still trapped inside, the dog belonging to one of those 2 people, and he went back in one final time. Gio said the dog made it out. Then he stopped speaking for a very long time. He said he learned all of this only 3 days later, when everything was already over and the case was about to be closed, and he chose silence, and he had lived with that silence for 3 years. He said that last night, when he watched his nephew push the file into the middle of the table in exchange for an ambulance, he finally understood that in his entire life, he had never once been brave enough to place a human being above everything else. Adeline stood only a few steps away, still holding a cup of water she hadn't touched. She had been there from the beginning. She didn't cry out, didn't rush toward him, didn't ask a single question. She simply stood there, and the cup tilted in her hand before she tightened her grip around it. For 3 years she had lived believing that her husband had died in a fire caused by an electrical short circuit, a meaningless death, a cruel accident of fate. Now she knew he hadn't died by accident, but she also knew something else, something she had never known during those 3 years, that he had managed to bring 2 people out of that building, and that in his final moments, he had gone back inside not because anyone forced him to, but because he heard a cry. He had died exactly the way he had lived. At noon that day, Renzo arrived at the hospital carrying the documents. Salvatore looked at him and said, "You hid it from me because you saw me smile for the first time in 3 years. Next time, let me hurt. I can take it." Renzo nodded without saying anything, then went back to his work. 3 weeks later, Adeline found the man. He was living in a temporary shelter south of the port, his hair completely white, And when she told him she was the wife of the emergency medical worker from that night, he stood motionless for a very long time. He told her that for 3 years he had asked everywhere, and no one would tell him the man's name. And eventually he stopped asking because he thought he had no right to know. Then he whistled, and from behind a sheet of canvas, an old dog with yellow fur threaded with gray came walking slowly toward them, its tail gently wagging. The man said the dog was still doing well, that it ate more than he did, and that every night it slept stretched across the doorway. Adeline sat down on the step and held out her hand. The dog came closer, sniffed her fingers, then sat beside her. She stayed there for a very long time, with one hand resting on its head, and for the first time in 3 years, she cried without feeling that there was nothing inside her except emptiness. Mrs. Rosalie regained consciousness on the 4th day. She recognized everyone, and she understood everything people said to her. But when she tried to speak, only broken sounds came out, and after 3 attempts, she gave up. The doctor said some of her speech might return, but it would take a very long time, and there would be words that never came back. Adeline still came to the hospital every afternoon. She said nothing about the warehouse and asked no questions. She simply did the things she had always done: massaged the old woman's hand, warmed the towels, placed the cup of water back into her hand, instead of lifting it to her mouth for her. By Saturday afternoon, Mrs. Rosalie motioned for her to open the bedside cabinet. Inside was an envelope. She had asked the housekeeper to bring the unfinished letter from Newport, and during the 4 days she had been lying there, she had finished writing it with the hand she could still move. The handwriting wandered across the page, some lines containing only 3 words, some places left blank before continuing farther down. Adeline opened it and read it right there beside the hospital bed beneath the afternoon light. The old woman wrote that she had known who Adeline was from the very beginning. 3 years earlier, she had held a compensation list that her son prepared after everything was already too late, and there had been 3 names on it. She had read the name Brennan over and over until she knew it by heart. Then she had asked questions, and she learned that the man had left behind a young wife and a little boy with an unhealthy heart. On the next line, she wrote that she hadn't hired Adeline to atone for anything. She wrote that money couldn't redeem anything, and that she had lived long enough to know it. She had hired her because she knew she didn't have much time left, and because she needed her son to meet someone who wasn't afraid of him. She wrote that for so many years, everyone who entered that house spoke to her son in the voice of someone carefully testing every step across thin ice, and when a man lived among voices like that for long enough, he could forget that he was human too. She wrote that she needed someone who would dare tell him to color it again with the right color. Then came the final part, and it was the part that made Adeline lower the letter into her lap and sit completely still. The old woman wrote that the monthly assistance for medication Adeline had been receiving for the past 3 years, the money that came through a parish support association with typed letters bearing no sender's name, the money that had paid for every box of Micah's medication since that winter, had never come from any association at all. It came from her. She had asked the priest to lend his name and pass the money along, so that not a single word on the paperwork would carry the Marchetti name, because she knew that if the boy's mother ever guessed the truth, she would return every dollar immediately. She wrote that she had gradually sold the things her husband had given her over the years of their marriage, one piece at a time, and she believed it was the best use those things had ever served in her entire life. In the second-to-last sentence, she wrote that she had waited a very long time for a reasonable excuse to bring Adeline into the house. She had waited until her illness became serious enough that no one would question why she needed a private caregiver, and when that day finally came, she had been happy, and she was sorry that she had felt happy about something like that. Adeline folded the letter. She took the old woman's trembling hand between both of hers and lowered her head, and Mrs. Rosalie placed her other hand gently on Adeline's hair, like a mother. Neither woman said a word, one because she couldn't, the other because there was no longer any need. Micah's surgery took place near the end of winter. Adeline sat in the waiting room with both hands clasped together, and she remained that way from morning onward. Salvatore sat one chair away from her without speaking, occasionally getting up to bring her a cup of coffee she never drank. Near noon, an older woman entered the waiting room, stopped at the doorway for a moment, then slowly approached. It was Owen's mother. For 3 years, the 2 women had never sat in the same room because too many things had been said between them that could never be taken back. She didn't say anything. She simply sat in the chair beside Adeline and placed a hand on her shoulder. Adeline didn't turn toward her. She only lifted her own hand and held on to that hand, and the 2 women sat that way until the doctor came out and told them that everything had gone well. One evening in early spring, after Micah had fallen asleep and the apartment above the bakery was lit only by the lamp over the kitchen table, Adeline told Salvatore something she had never told anyone, not even Owen. She said she didn't know what her parents looked like, and she had never had a kind story she could tell herself about them. The only thing she knew was that she had been found on a February morning, lying in a blanket-lined box outside the door of a fire station in Pawtucket when she was only a few days old. Whoever had left her there had chosen that place because someone was always awake. She said that all her life, for reasons she had never understood, she kept following people who ran toward the places everyone else was running away from. She studied nursing. She worked in an emergency department. She married an emergency medical worker. And for 6 years, her son had drawn the same thing over and over again, and she had never explained the reason to anyone because she wasn't even certain there was one. Salvatore listened to everything without interrupting. Then he said that if someone had placed her there, because it was a place where people stayed awake all night, then everything she had done with her life since that morning was the longest answer a human being could ever write to an act like that. His sentence was announced near the end of spring. He didn't have to go to prison. What they took from him was everything else that remained. He was permanently barred from holding any executive position in any business in the state. The family's assets were placed under supervision. Every expenditure above a certain amount had to be approved by a board on which he had no voice. The man who had once erased 60 years of a name from New England with a single quiet sentence now had to file an application and wait for permission if he wanted to open a small restaurant near the harbor. But the transfer documents had been signed. Every name on the list his uncle had placed on the table that day kept their job, with a real contract and real insurance. The dock worker who had once carried him on his shoulders still went to the port every morning, except now he had paid vacation days. Gio Marchetti accepted responsibility for his part and didn't appeal. Before he left, he went to the hospital to see his sister-in-law one last time, sat beside her bed for a very long while without speaking, then stood and said, "I'm sorry. It's far too late, but I still have to say it." Camilla Voss was removed by the foundation board from every activity connected to it, and her name gradually disappeared from the rooms where it had once moved so easily. On the evening Salvatore proposed, he didn't choose Newport. He didn't choose a restaurant either. There were no flowers and no witnesses. He came to the apartment above the bakery, where the oven still began running before dawn, where the wall was still covered with bright red fire trucks drawn by a 6-year-old hand. He said he didn't have much left to offer, that the man he had been 3 years earlier could have given her anything, while the man he was now had to ask permission even to open a small restaurant. He said he wasn't going to promise her anything, because he had once hesitated for 3 seconds at the exact moment she needed him most, and a man who had done that shouldn't make promises. Adeline took his hand and told him he didn't need to promise. She said, "I only need you to tell me the truth, even when the truth is difficult to hear." Then she said yes. Micah woke because of the sound of their voices, came out rubbing his eyes, looked at the two of them, and asked whether something happy had happened. When they told him, he nodded very seriously and said that in that case, tomorrow Salvatore would have to color another picture. This story leaves us with a few very simple things. A person's worth doesn't come from the job they do, the amount of money in their account, and certainly not from the worst rumor people repeat behind their back. One mistake should never be allowed to become a life sentence for an entire human life. Real love doesn't bind someone with debt or gratitude. It gives the other person back the right to say no without losing any of their dignity. And there are quiet people all around us. People who wash the faces of the sick, support the hands of the elderly as they learn to walk again, sit awake through long nights when no one is watching. They are the ones who keep this world warm. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories every day. How do you feel about the story of Adeline and Salvatore? Please leave a few lines in the comments so we can hear what you truly feel deep in your heart. We wish you and your family good health, happiness, and peace every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.